When we were children, there was no need to know who the king was in the fairy story. The thing that made a 7-year-old child go thump with delight was this one sovereign truth, the reality of all realities. Once there was a king. But the readers of this modern age have become far more exact and specific. When they hear such an opening to a story, they immediately become critical and suspicious. They apply the searchlight of science to its legendary haze and ask, which king? The storytellers have also become more precise. These days, they no longer content with the old indefinite, once there was a king, but instead have new types of story openings like, once there was a king named Ajatashatru. Now let me take you all back to my fairy story, when I was the little girl who was 7 years old and my tutor was prevented from coming that evening. I remember sitting on the couch with my grandmother telling me this beautiful fairy story. Once there was a king, and the king had a queen. But the king had no son, and so the king had to go to the forest for 12 years to practice austerities to obtain a son. I remember thinking at that point of time, why did the king want a son? He would only be born. And also, why would he have to go into the forest to practice austerities for so long? The only reason I would go into the forest was to get away from my tutor. But my grandmother went on. But the king had left behind with his queen a little daughter who grew up to become a beautiful princess. 12 years passed, and the princess had reached the full bloom of her youth. As the king entered the palace once again after 12 years, he did not even recognize his own daughter. The queen exclaimed, "Do you not realize that she is your own daughter? How evil is my fate!" For some time, the king remained in silent amazement. But then he asked, "Why didn't you give her hand in marriage?" The queen replied, "You were away, and how could I find her a suitable husband?" At this, the king, strangely excited, vowed that the first person he would see the next day would get married to his golden daughter. And that's what happened. The next day, as the king stepped out of his palace, he saw a 7-year-old boy, the son of a Brahmin, gathering sticks for firewood. Immediately the king realized that he would marry his golden daughter to this fortunate young lad. Who can interfere with the king's command? At once marriage garlands were exchanged, rites were done, and the little boy and the beautiful princess became husband and wife. 4 to 5 years passed this way. However, then his friends began to ask him, "Who is that beautiful lady who lives with you in the palace with 7 wings?" The prince had no answer. He only remembered that one day he was gathering sticks and a huge commotion had arisen. So every day he would go back to the princess and ask, "Tell me, O beautiful lady, who are you?" The princess would say, "Let it pass untold today." Day after day, month after month, year after year, the princess gave the same reply. After 4 to 5 years, the prince got so impatient that he almost shouted, "If you don't tell me, O beautiful lady, who you are, I will leave this palace with 7 wings." The princess said, "I will surely tell you tomorrow." And so the prince began to count the hours in expectation. Finally, when the princess got ready to reveal her identity, she entered the room to let the prince know who she was, who the prince was. She realized that the prince was bitten by a serpent, and her little boy husband was lying still with no trace of life in him. I remember that on hearing this sentence, my heartbeat ceased to a throb, and I asked with a voice choking with tears, "What then?" My grandmother went on, "But what was the use with going on with the story? It would only lead to what was more and more impossible. How did the story come to such a sudden, shocking end?" And so my grandmother had to call back the fairy tale from the ever-shut chamber of the great end. And she does that so simply, so gracefully, merely by floating the still Brahmin boy on a banana leaf and floating him down a river, having some incantations read by magicians. As she was saying this, my tired eyelids had weighed down with sleep. And thus we send the 7-year-old daughter and the still Brahmin boy floating down the river of imagination. Thank you.